This is My Autism and Me, the podcast by Alfie Blanchflower.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of My Autism and Me. Just before we start, I want to quickly apologise for the delay of this episode. I've had a lot to do this week, so I couldn't get around to recording and editing the podcast. I also want to apologise about how quiet Mum was in previous episodes. I'm working on this, and hopefully you should notice a difference today. In today's episode, we will be covering my experience from years 4 and 5 at school. For each year, I will be accompanied by my mum to share her point of view. Heading straight into year 4, this was a big year for me. I started off at my first school with my first teacher of the year. She then left the school and another teacher took over. This made me slightly more anxious. On top of that, throughout year 4, bullying became quite bad at that school. It was not right for me. About halfway through the year, I left that school. Mum works at another school in the area, so we tried to get me in there, but struggled. One day, Dad phoned and said there was a space at a school that is literally at the top of the road that we live on. I went there for the rest of my primary life. However, they still weren't as good as they could have been on the support front. On day 1, I had a huge panic attack whilst walking through the classroom door. I really didn't feel comfortable with all that. I was in such shock with the change. Throwing me off even more, I dropped my water bottle. It doesn't sound that much, however given the state I was already in, it wasn't good. After day 1, nearly every day I would have a panic attack.
Year 4 was very difficult for Alfie. He was bullied at his original primary school and the teachers weren't very supportive at all. It was an awful experience for all of us, so I pulled Alfie out of the school, hoping I could get him into my school. However, there was no space. There was a space that Alfie's dad found at a different school, so we all decided that was for the best. However, it was difficult from day 1. Even though we explained what had happened at Alfie's previous school and that he'd need support with this, it wasn't really forthcoming. Every day was a real struggle. I can remember one day Alfie nearly knocking over a teaching assistant to run out of class. His fight or flight instinct was so strong and growing stronger every day. Nothing that the school offered worked and nobody seemed to understand.
Moving on to year 5, it wasn't that much better. I had a new teacher that had just joined the school along with 2 other teachers. She couldn't cope with my class and ended up leaving the school. The next year, the other 2 left as well. We then had another teacher who was lovely but could come across as strict and not nice at some points. The panic attacks slightly calmed down but were still common. Overall, year 5 wasn't one of the best years.
Year 5 was a little calmer than year 4, but not really by much. I was trying to explain to school why Alfie wasn't coping and offered as much help as I could, but they just didn't seem to understand. Alfie had one friend who really seemed to help, and the school, rather than offering support, would expect him to help Alfie, which I felt awful about. Why on earth would professionals expect a year 5 child to support my son? He was amazing at it, but it just wasn't fair. Every day was a battle. Panic attacks, feeling poorly, etc. Anything to avoid school. All the time I'm trying to keep hold of my job. Luckily they've been so supportive and understanding. I don't know where we'd be without them.
Now it's time for parent tips.
Listen to your child. Take all the advice you can get and support offered. Always try what's suggested. That way you know you've tried everything possible to help. Also listen to your gut feeling. More often than not you're right. And lastly, be kind to yourself. If you don't look after you, you won't be able to support your child as well as you could do.
And my tip for this week would be, don't make the mistake my teachers made. If you're listening to this podcast because you think your child may have ASD, get in touch with your healthcare service. It's best to get checked early, therefore the support required can be given to your child. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. To review our podcast, go to linktree/myautismandme and select review our podcast. That's linktr.ee/myautismandme. If you need help because you've had a rough day or feel alone, go to the same link and select Get Help. Fill in the form and we aim to respond within 24 hours. Thanks for listening and we will see you in episode 5.
You have been listening to My Autism and Me, the podcast by Alfie Blanchflower.